There are moments in history when silence is power and words are weapons. Yesterday, the air was heavy, not with smoke, but with expectation. The cameras clicked. The world leaned in. And then he spoke. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't rage. It was the kind of tone that makes you stop breathing, a voice sharpened not by anger, but by truth. He did not threaten. He did not beg. He simply stated what needed to be said. Every syllable was a stone dropped into still water, ripples crossing oceans, reaching palaces, parliaments, and presidents. In those few minutes, alliances questioned themselves. Rivals took note. And the people felt something they had not felt in a long time, pride and certainty. This was not just a statement. It was a mirror held up to the world. It showed them what strength looks like without aggression and what resolve sounds like without noise. Nations whispered behind closed doors. Markets hesitated. And somewhere, far away, those who underestimated him reached for the phone, wondering if it was already too late. Words are not always gentle. They can shake empires. They can rewrite maps. And when spoken with conviction, they can make the world tremble. History will remember this day, not because of the headlines, but because of the unshakable truth that was laid bare. In the end, the question remains, were these the words of a diplomat or the quiet, calculated declaration of war? In the realm of power, not all battles are fought with guns and armies. Some are fought in the quiet tension of conference rooms, across tables where nothing moves except the eyes of those who understand the stakes. Words in such moments are no longer mere sounds. They become instruments of influence, precision tools that can dismantle arguments, shift alliances, and in the most extreme cases, alter the course of history itself. When Jaishankar spoke, it wasn't the content alone that carried weight. It was the recognition, even in real time, that his words were being wielded as weapons. Every syllable was deliberate, every pause intentional, and every phrase constructed, not just to be heard, but to be felt in the deepest recesses of the listener's mind. Words have the advantage of being invisible. They cannot be intercepted like missiles. They leave no smoke trail to be followed. Yet, when they are sharp enough, they cut deeper than steel. His language was not wrapped in unnecessary ornamentation. It was stripped to its essence, delivering the core message with surgical precision. There was no excess, no filler, no misstep that could be used against him. This economy of language made each statement heavier, as if every sentence was weighted with the gravity of nations. It was the difference between throwing stones and placing a single, well-aimed strike that shatters the foundation. In diplomacy, the power of words often comes from what is left unsaid. This was the mastery on display. He spoke enough to make his position unambiguous, yet left space for interpretation, a gap in which allies could read reassurance and adversaries could see warning. This duality gave his words a dangerous flexibility, allowing them to resonate in multiple directions at once. Those who wanted peace could see the path. Those who wanted confrontation could hear the challenge. And the brilliance lay in the fact that neither could claim to be wrong. The weight of his words was magnified by the silence that followed them. In that stillness, leaders across the world replayed what they had just heard, parsing each clause for hidden meaning, replaying each pause for unspoken intent. Silence in such moments is not absence. It is the echo of a strike, the reverberation of a blow that has already landed. And this silence was not empty. It was filled with questions, calculations, and the uneasy awareness that something significant had just shifted in the balance of power. The psychological effect of such speech cannot be underestimated. Words that carry this kind of force are not just heard. They linger, gnawing at the mind long after the conversation has ended. They reshape how opponents perceive you, how allies measure your resolve, and how the public defines your leadership. This is why the most powerful leaders throughout history have been those who understand that language is a weapon, one that can rally millions without firing a single shot. In this moment, his words became more than communication. They became an act of positioning, a strategic maneuver in the invisible chess game of international politics. Like an expert swordsman, he did not swing wildly. He measured his distance, read his opponent's stance, and delivered a single, precise cut. That is why the room seemed to tighten, why the air felt heavier, why the world, for just a breath, trembled, not because an army had been mobilized, but because a sentence had been spoken. There is a certain power in the way a message is delivered, a strength that comes not from volume or theatrics, but from the mastery of control. The calm but commanding tone in this moment carried more impact than any speech drenched in anger or noise could have. It was the kind of delivery that made people instinctively lean forward, not because they feared missing a word, but because they knew that every word was chosen with precision. This was not the language of desperation or arrogance. It was the sound of absolute certainty. When someone speaks in such a measured way, the listener is left with no doubt that the speaker is in complete control of both the message and the moment. The voice did not rise or fall dramatically, yet it held the ability to dominate the room almost as if it carried its own gravity. This restraint in delivery is often more intimidating than open aggression because it suggests that the speaker does not need to shout to be heard. It suggests a mind that has already considered every possibility, weighed every consequence, and stands unshaken by any of them. The tone itself carried layers of meaning. On the surface, it was calm, steady, and even respectful. Beneath that, it radiated an unspoken warning. There is no panic here, no uncertainty, and certainly no hesitation. It communicated that the decision had already been made, the position already set, and nothing in the room or outside it would shift it. This composure had a disarming effect, especially on those who might have been expecting a more emotional or confrontational exchange. Instead of predictable volatility, they were met with the kind of unflinching poise that forces the mind to reconsider its own approach. A calm but commanding delivery has a way of slowing time for the audience. Every word becomes heavier, more deliberate, because the listener is given the space to absorb it fully. This pacing is not accidental. It is a deliberate tactic, one that forces opponents to sit with the weight of what is being said. In those pauses, people are left alone with their own thoughts, their own doubts, and their own fears. It is in those seconds of quiet that the true impact of the message takes root. There is also a certain authority that comes from the absence of unnecessary emotion. Anger can be dismissed as irrational, joy as naive, sorrow as weakness, but calmness, when coupled with conviction, is almost impossible to discredit. It strips away the chance for the opposition to argue that the message is clouded by passion. Instead, they are left confronting the pure logic and intention behind it. This is why a steady voice, backed by unwavering certainty, can pierce through political noise and reach directly into the minds of those listening. In the end, this style of delivery transforms the spoken word into something larger than speech. It becomes a statement of presence, a demonstration of power that requires no force to prove itself. The calmness itself becomes a form of dominance, the quiet assurance of someone who knows they cannot be swayed. And when the words are backed by that kind of unshakable control, they do not simply pass through the air, they settle deep, leaving a mark that lingers long after the moment has passed. The true measure of a statement's power is not only in how it is spoken, but in how far its echoes travel. In this case, the impact was immediate and far-reaching, rippling outwards from the room where the words were delivered to the highest offices and deepest corridors of power across the globe. It was as if the speech had been aimed not at a single audience, but at an entire international stage. Within moments, diplomats were re-evaluating their positions, analysts were rewriting their assessments, and media outlets were rushing to capture the weight of what had just been said. The world had not just heard the words, it had felt them. When words create such a shockwave, they cross borders faster than any formal communique. They move not only through headlines and broadcasts, but also through the whispered conversations between leaders, the encrypted messages of advisors, and the urgent meetings called in the dead of night. In capitals thousands of miles away, foreign ministries replayed the footage, pausing at key moments, dissecting tone, facial expression, and even the order of the sentences. This was not idle curiosity. It was a calculated effort to understand what these words meant for them and how their next steps might be shaped by them. For allies, the message carried a reassurance wrapped in resolve. It signaled that strength still held firm, that the lines of commitment had not blurred. It reminded them that their positions were anchored by a leadership unafraid to speak plainly in a world accustomed to diplomatic half measures. For adversaries, however, the tone was very different. What they heard was not comfort, but a warning, a clear signal that the boundaries they might have tested in the shadows were now drawn in the light for all to see. It was not a threat shouted in rage, but a line etched with quiet finality. Global markets, sensitive to shifts in political winds, reacted in their own way. Traders and economists watching the developments in real time debated the potential fallout. Would alliances harden? Would trade routes be reshaped? Would new sanctions or agreements emerge from the shock? Even in financial centers far from the political sphere, the speech was a point of analysis, a factor to weigh in forecasts and projections. The reach of those words was not limited to policy. It seeped into the calculations of commerce and strategy alike. Ordinary citizens, too, felt the resonance. In countries near and far, people heard the statement through the filter of their own experiences, their own national narratives. Some found themselves filled with pride, inspired by the clarity and courage of the stance. Others, especially in rival nations, felt an unease, sensing that their leaders might soon be forced into difficult decisions. This is the unique power of words that ripple globally. They do not remain locked in the minds of officials, but instead shape public perception, which in turn shapes political will. Perhaps most telling was the shift in the posture of those who had underestimated the speaker. Before the words were uttered, there may have been assumptions of hesitation, of cautious maneuvering. But after the final syllable, those assumptions no longer stood. Across the world, in boardrooms, war rooms, and parliamentary chambers, people recognized that the balance had tilted slightly, that a new certainty had entered the equation. The speech had not been an isolated event. It was now a reference point, a marker in time from which future decisions would be measured. In that sense, the world had not only listened, it had been moved, and it would not return to the state it was in before those words were spoken. Strength, when stripped of threats, has a unique kind of gravity. It draws attention not by the promise of force, but by the undeniable confidence of someone who knows they can act if needed, yet chooses restraint. In the moment of this speech, there was no saber rattling, no dramatic promises of retaliation, and no overbearing attempt to intimidate. Instead, there was clarity, steadiness, and an unshakable sense of control. That is the essence of strength without threats. It is not about announcing one's capabilities, but about letting the world feel them without a single explicit declaration. Such restraint speaks volumes because it leaves no room for bluster to dilute the message. When someone avoids threats, their words often carry more weight, not less, because they are rooted in conviction rather than performance. Here, every sentence stood on its own, needing no amplification through dramatic gestures or ultimatums. It was as though the message was carved in stone before it was spoken, unchangeable, solid, and ready to withstand any storm. This kind of communication has a way of silencing even the most vocal critics because there is nothing reckless to attack, no emotional outburst to exploit. It also communicates discipline, a trait that earns both respect and caution from allies and rivals alike. Those listening understood that the absence of threats did not mean an absence of power. On the contrary, it implied that the speaker was so certain of their position that they did not need to brandish it like a weapon. This is a subtle but powerful psychological tactic. It places the burden of interpretation on the listener. Enemies are left to wonder what lies beneath the calm, what resources and strategies remain unseen, and what consequences might follow if the line being drawn is crossed. This approach also strengthens credibility. Threats can sometimes create the opposite of their intended effect. They can provoke defiance, harden opposition, or even make the speaker appear desperate to project strength. But by refraining from making them, the speaker in this moment avoided those traps entirely. The focus remained on the substance of the position being stated, not on the drama of imagined scenarios. It was as if the message itself was the shield and the sword, requiring no additional embellishment to prove its force. Moreover, strength without threats sends a signal to the wider world that the speaker operates on a higher level of strategic thinking. It shows that they are not driven by impulse, but by a long-term vision, a calculated understanding of timing and consequences. This calm assurance has a way of unsettling even the most aggressive adversaries because they cannot predict the next move. They cannot be sure whether the stillness is a sign of patience or the prelude to decisive action. For those who support the speaker's position, this restraint is a rallying point. It reassures them that their leadership is not reckless, that it will not drag them into unnecessary conflict, but will also not back down from defending core principles. It creates an image of stability, which in uncertain times is as valuable as any show of military or economic might. And for those standing on the sidelines, unsure of which way to lean, it offers an example of dignity under pressure, an image that can sway opinion far more effectively than a loud confrontation ever could. In the end, the refusal to issue threats did not weaken the message. It strengthened it. The power was not in what might be done, but in the quiet certainty that if action became necessary, it would be taken without hesitation, without noise, and without the need for advance warning. That is the kind of strength that commands attention, earns respect, and leaves the world listening long after the words have been spoken. When words land with enough force to alter perceptions, they inevitably shift the political landscape. This moment was no exception. The speech carried such clarity and weight that it forced powerful nations to pause and re-examine their positions. Long-standing alliances, once thought unshakable, were quietly reviewed. Leaders who had been comfortable with the status quo began to wonder whether the ground beneath them was shifting. It was not the kind of shift that happens with fanfare or public declarations. It was a quieter, more strategic recalibration happening in private meeting rooms, over encrypted calls, and in the hushed corridors of influence. For allies, the speech was both a reminder and a challenge. It reminded them why they stood where they did, affirming that their trust had not been misplaced, but it also challenged them to match that same level of resolve. Some may have felt the need to reaffirm their commitments more strongly, while others may have recognized that remaining passive could now be seen as weakness. This ripple effect within friendly nations was perhaps one of the most strategic outcomes, strengthening bonds with those willing to stand firm while subtly exposing hesitation in those who were not. Adversaries, on the other hand, felt the message differently. The absence of direct threats made it impossible to dismiss the speech as bluster, which is often the luxury given when rhetoric turns fiery. Instead, the calm yet unwavering tone made it clear that any misstep would be noticed, calculated, and met with decisive, though unspecified, responses. This ambiguity was its own form of pressure. Without knowing exactly what the response might be, rivals were left to imagine scenarios, weigh risks, and, in many cases, restrain themselves. In the days following such statements, intelligence agencies and foreign policy advisors often work overtime, assessing not only the words themselves, but the reaction they provoke among other nations. A statement of this magnitude can expose fault lines in regional blocs, reveal which countries are quick to adapt, and which cling stubbornly to outdated positions. This intelligence is valuable. It allows the speaker's side to understand where influence is growing and where it is being resisted. Markets, too, tend to react to such shifts in alliances and rivalries. While the public focus may be on diplomatic statements, behind the scenes, economic stakeholders know that political stability or the lack of it directly impacts trade agreements, energy supplies, and investment flows. The ripples of this speech likely reached boardrooms and financial institutions, prompting reevaluations of where to invest, which partnerships to strengthen, and which markets to approach with greater caution. Perhaps the most telling impact was in the private conversations between nations that neither strongly opposed nor strongly supported the speaker. These middle ground, countries often skilled at walking the tightrope between opposing powers, found themselves reconsidering the cost of neutrality. Staying silent in the face of such a decisive statement could risk alienating one side or emboldening the other. For them, the speech created a moment of choice, a subtle but powerful push to lean in one direction. Ultimately, shifting alliances is not always about immediate declarations or dramatic policy reversals. More often, it begins with moments like this, moments where a single speech forces leaders to rerun their calculations, to question whether their current path is sustainable, and to consider whether aligning more closely with the voice they have just heard might offer greater stability or opportunity. These are the kinds of shifts that, while invisible at first, can change the shape of international relations in ways that only become clear months or even years later. The speech may have lasted only minutes, but the reassessments it triggered could last far longer. There are times when a speech ends not with applause, but with a question that lingers in the minds of everyone who heard it. This was one of those moments. The message had been clear, but the intent less so. Was this a carefully measured act of diplomacy meant to preserve balance and avoid escalation? Or was it a veiled provocation, a warning so sharp that it might, in the wrong hands, be read as the first step toward conflict? That ambiguity was part of its power. By leaving the line between peace and confrontation undefined, the speaker forced the world to grapple with multiple interpretations at once. Diplomacy, at its highest level, often thrives on this kind of uncertainty. If every statement is clear, cut, it leaves no room for strategic flexibility. By delivering a message that could be understood in more than one way, the speaker maintained an advantage. Allies could take comfort in the show of resolve, framing it as a commitment to protect shared interests. Adversaries, however, might interpret the same words as a direct challenge, one that dared them to test boundaries. This dual reading created a tension that hung in the air long after the last sentence was spoken. The media quickly seized on the uncertainty, each outlet shaping the narrative according to its own audience. Some painted the speech as a masterstroke of diplomatic skill, firm yet measured, forceful yet reasonable. Others cast it as a thinly veiled declaration of hostility, a calculated move designed to unsettle and provoke. This divergence in coverage only deepened the mystery, making it harder to pin down exactly what the intended message had been. And perhaps that was the point, to keep everyone guessing, to ensure that no one could predict the next move with certainty. Among political leaders, the ambiguity posed both a challenge and an opportunity. For some, it created the space to maneuver diplomatically, to approach the speaker's camp with offers of dialogue or cooperation. For others, it raised alarms, prompting contingency plans and defensive measures. In both cases, the speech succeeded in shifting the strategic landscape without a single explicit threat or concession. It set the stage for action without revealing whether that action would be reconciliation or escalation. The psychological effect on adversaries was particularly potent. Not knowing whether the words signaled peace or conflict forced them into a state of heightened vigilance. When an opponent is unsure of your true intentions, they must prepare for multiple possibilities, which can stretch their resources and strain their decision-making. This kind of pressure is a weapon in itself, one that can destabilize even the most confident rival. For the public, the uncertainty had a different impact. Supporters saw strength in the ambiguity, interpreting it as a sign of strategic brilliance. Critics, however, worried that leaving intentions unclear could invite misunderstandings, the kind that have historically led to miscalculations and unintended confrontations. This debate ensured that the speech would remain a subject of conversation well beyond the immediate news cycle, embedding it into the broader narrative of geopolitical maneuvering. In the end, the lack of a definitive answer to the question, diplomacy or provocation, was not a weakness, but a deliberate design. It created a kind of suspended tension, a moment in which the world was left waiting for the next move, acutely aware that whatever came next would reveal the true nature of what had just been said. Until then, the ambiguity would remain, holding the world in a delicate balance between dialogue and danger.